August 24th, 1955, a young man from Chicago was visiting his cousins in Mississippi, where he bragged about the fact that in Chicago he was able to date a white young woman as a 14-year-old black young man. His cousins, a little bit in disbelief, dared him to go into the candy store that they were out in front of and ask the woman inside out on a date. They did not follow him in, but it was heard on his way out that he said to her, "Bye, baby." Later that night, Carolyn Bryant would later claim that Emmett Till made lewd advances, groped her, and wolf-whistled at her as he sauntered out of the business. This was the report that her husband received 4 days later when he returned from a business trip. And on that night, August 28th, her husband, as well as her blood brother, would go visit Emmett Till's uncle and demand that he come outside to speak with them. Till's uncle pled that they not do so, but unable to prevail, Emmett Till went outside, and that was the last time he was seen again until 3 days later when his body was found dead in the river. These two men made Emmett carry a 75-pound cotton gin fan to the bank of the Tallahatchie River, where they ordered him to take off of his clothes. They beat him nearly to death, gouged out one of his eyes, shot him in the head, and then threw his body, tied to the cotton gin fan with barbed wire, into the river. When his body was discovered 3 days later, it was so disfigured that he was unrecognizable, other than the ring that was on his finger by which he was identified. In less than 2 weeks, when we used to have speedy trials, once his body was buried, these two men were put on trial in the segregated courthouse of Sumner, Mississippi. And on September 23rd, an all-white jury in less than 1 hour issued a verdict of not guilty, explaining that the state had failed to prove the identity of the body that was found. And if all that wasn't bad enough, Carolyn Bryant would later recant her original testimony, admitting that Emmett Till never touched her, nor harassed her, saying, "Nothing that boy did ever could justify what happened to him." There's a podcast out fairly recently by the name of Do No Harm that highlights a family from Texas, the Bright family, who lost their child in the system to a CPS worker that was overzealous at one level and completely incompetent at another. This mother, Melissa Bright, took her child out on a hot Texas summer day to play in the sprinkler. She had a 5-month-old and a 2-year-old, and once they were done playing in the sprinkler, she decided that they needed to be toweled off before traipsing through the house soaking wet. But because the concrete was so hot and she didn't want them dirty in the grass, she put her 5-month-old on a lawn chair and turned around to wipe dry the 2-year-old child, at which point she heard a horrible scream. Her 5-month-old having hit the ground, she immediately called 911, reported the incident, told them what she had done, admitted all the fault that she could, that she was negligent in thinking that her non-crawling 5-month-old would not be able to wriggle himself from the chair. Even though she had no previous issues, even though the child had no other signs of neglect, nor did the 2-year-old, because of a previous case that had recently taken place in Texas where CPS neglected a child after 50 phone calls and that child died, they all of a sudden felt the need to act, because that is how justice works sometimes. Our negligence in the first instance means our overexuberance in yours. And so they did. And though the doctors said it was imperative that the child stay calm throughout the night because of the fractures that were in its skull, they uprooted this nursing child from his parents' home, put them with relatives, where the child would then scream night and day for 5 days. The parents reached out to CPS, seeing what they could do to alleviate the situation. CPS never responded. So thinking that the deal was done and CPS didn't care, they went and took their child, and that child lived at home for 22 days. Mason lived there, was nursed back to health, and so forth. And 22 days later, a text comes from the CPS worker asking how the child is, to which the mother joyfully responded that he's doing well, sent pictures of the child. And in 24 hours, that child and his older sister would be ripped out of the home when an emergency injunction and court hearing was called, in which the parents were never informed and never allowed to testify on their own behalf. Eventually, when it was all brought out in court, because this family could afford a lawyer and many others in the situation could not, Through text messages, it was learned that the CPS workers came and snatched the child from the home, not because of concern for the child, but they realized that they had been negligent and didn't respond to a text from 22 days earlier. So in order to cover their own backs and to not get in trouble with their supervisor, they acted immediately and forcefully to remove a child from its parents, showing full well that the safety of the child was the least of their concerns, especially when the text chain was deleted only to be recovered by police officers later. And while the verdict was eventually reversed, CPS to this day has never admitted fault. Heard a story just this week of a father who was killed on his motorcycle by someone who was texting and driving, and the traffic camera that was snagged from the scene shows the woman was on the phone looking down at her phone for a complete 6 seconds, never looking up at the road before she plowed into the back of this father and husband, killing him immediately. She was fined $188 and did no jail time. I mean, so how do these stories make you feel? And why do they make you feel that way? And if you have a normal reaction, you're probably mad and maybe sickened, frustrated. What in the world is the matter with our system or with the reality of justice? How is it that people entrusted to defend us in accordance with the law don't always do so, and in fact sometimes use the law to do quite the opposite? Well, it's this very outrage that our text is consumed with this morning, and we'll find in it some, in one sense, very discouraging news. This isn't a new problem, but also hopefully in it some form of encouragement as well. And the first thing I want us to see then is the problem of injustice. The problem of injustice. The teacher in our text, you'll notice, has just lifted his head. He says, the very first thing he says, I looked and I saw. And so again, as we look at the book of Ecclesiastes, have to remember our frame of reference. This is Kohelet, the teacher, the preacher, who is saying, I want to see all there is to see under the sun. What is life like in this world, for real, without any kind of varnish, without any kind of spiritualizing it or, Pollyanna version of life? What is life like in this world under the sun? That frame of reference, of course, is limited. He's simply reporting what is, and this is what he sees. It says, I looked to the place of justice, and even there I saw unrighteousness. So notice, he says, I looked to the places that were officially charged on earth with keeping justice in the world. God has ordained certain people in the world through governments and courts and law enforcement to be those who keep justice in the world. He says, so I looked at those places thinking maybe I will find some sort of respite there. And he says, and what I found when I looked at the places of justice was that there was injustice. I looked at the places of righteousness and there was unrighteousness. And how often do we see this in our own lives? You look at even the courtrooms of our own nation. If you have enough money and enough slick lawyers, you can get away with anything, including murder. If you look in the same place and you don't have enough money and you can't afford a good lawyer, you get something given to you in the system of bureaucracy that may not represent you well, and oftentimes you are overlooked, and the sentencing that you get is far different than those who could afford better representation. Whether we look in the chambers of Congress where laws are to be passed that uphold liberty and dignity and what is just, and we see people there that began with such promise that we had so much hope in, and we see them now compromised and entangled and soiled by the very same system that they went there to undo and to fight. And something is broken. And that something is exactly what Kohelet is seeing, and in seeing it, it grieves him. And I'm sure it grieves us and well. Part of our angst as people in this age is the knowledge that life just isn't fair. And we learn that very early in life. You learn it from your parents. If you have siblings, you learn it real quick and harshly over and over and over again. But life isn't fair, and that's not going to change anytime soon. And Kohelet says that really is the way it is. When I look to the place where fairness was supposed to be represented, where justice was supposed to be blind, he says, even there it was just oily and ultimately degraded. And on top of the fact that life's not fair, we often are powerless to do anything about it for the most part. I mean, think about the things that we wish we could change. I mean, think about even just the little things you wish you could change. Those that you love. If you've ever been a parent of a child that's struggling in school, maybe they're just having trouble making friends, or maybe they're getting picked on by people, they just don't quite fit, and you wish you could remedy the situation. But even for your own child, you can't fix every difficulty they run into and every injustice they face. How much less these larger scale problems worldwide? The world is crooked. And while we are called to do the right thing where we can, even then we realize we can't do it all right. And those places above, even if we do it all right, the places above us that may not have any interest in the same justice we do can completely undo or thwart our efforts all the same. It's seemingly futile or vain, as Kohelet says. And this is a problem. It's a problem that life isn't fair. It's a problem that justice should be found in certain places, and instead we find wickedness. And it's a problem, unfortunately, that isn't going anywhere. This is one of the more difficult things to kind of take part in. If some of you in our congregation are in law enforcement, the rest of you should talk to them. They don't wake up in the morning ever thinking like, today's the day we would probably rid the last bad guy on earth and we don't have to do our job anymore. They will always be in business. They will always have something to do. The problem of injustice is not going anywhere. And so if that's the problem of injustice, the next thing we see in the text is the problem of justice. The teacher goes on to say, well, if there's a season for everything, remember this is on the tail or the back end of his going through that beautiful poem, that there's a season for everything under heaven. There's a time to live and a time to die and so on and so forth. He says, well, if that's true, then there must also be a season where God does what is just in His own timing. But for Kohelet, the problem is he just can't see it. And again, notice the phrasing of the text over and over, and I saw, and I saw, and I said, and I said. He's saying, I know according to this reality that God's in charge of everything, there must also be a time when He is charged with bringing justice on earth. But when I look around, I don't see it anywhere. And for all the staring I do, I can't bring it to fruition. And so instead he says, the delay of justice must be then a test to see if we are beasts. What an interesting thing. Today is not a good self-esteem day, just so you know. At least about what he's about to say about us next. He says, surely there is a time for God's justice, but He delays it, and His delay shows us something about ourselves. I mean, think about that. What will man do on earth if justice isn't forthcoming? If God delays His justice, what will it prove about mankind? We'll pick up any history book. What has it proven about mankind? God has delayed bringing ultimate justice on earth up until now, and we have proved over and over that we act like animals if given enough room and enough power to do so. But because we act like animals, you'll notice the text tells us we die just like animals. Maybe we can say it this way. Everyone on earth wants justice. It's built into us to want it. Even the preacher says it has to be that God will somehow judge the world, even though I can't see when He's going to do it. Everyone has this deep-seated sense that certain things aren't right in the world and need to be fixed. Whether or not they believe in God or not, there is this deep urge to fix the problem. If you don't believe me, just go on Twitter, pick any issue, pick any side. There are people deeply committed to righting the wrong of that particular issue. And people who dismiss God or any kind of ultimate authority altogether still want to fight for things to be right in the earth, even if they have no reason, or at least no grounding reason to do so. But the problem is, man often overlooks this one thing, that we are also not right, and we need to be fixed. There's something wrong with us. When we're given enough space and time, we act like beasts, and therefore, if God is just, then that has implications for me as well. Not just for those bad people out there. It has something to say about me and the fact that God does owe me a particular outcome. And one thing that shows this to man infallibly is that every man dies. We all die just like the animals. And this is a testimony that God really is keeping His promise to judge all of creation. Well, what do I mean? You notice the language he uses there, especially in verse 20, when he says, all go to the same place. They all go dust to dust. The beast goes down in the dust, we go down in the dust. What's he doing? He's quoting Genesis and the curse that God has placed on man when he says, from dust you were created, and to dust you shall return. It is a judgment from sin that everybody dies. So every time we go to a funeral, we can announce, without knowing the person, without knowing all the details of their life, that death really is a sign and a testimony that God is judging sin for every one of us. We are buried in the same earth as our family dog will be buried in. I mean, what an indictment against what we've done. You hear the language, right? Man is like a beast, and it should give you a little bit of a reaction to where, like, the Bible doesn't seem to say that. We're above the animals, right? We were made to have dominion over the animals. We have been made in God's image. We're different than the animals, and that is all very true. But the preacher is focusing on one thing. He says, I'm looking at the end of the line, and I'm noticing that my grave is right next to the grave of the family pet. And we both go back into the soil the same exact way. So whatever work I've done, however my life was better on earth, we have the exact same end. So what's the gain in being men? We end up dying like beasts. And while we may cry out for justice because of the fact that we were made in the image of God and we were intended to rule the world as those made in His image, our conclusion, the conclusion of our life, unfortunately, is just like the cow in town who never cared for one matter of justice. He didn't even spend one moment of his life considering it, didn't care at all. And guess what? He's going to die just like you're going to die and return to dust, just like you're going to return. And Kohelet just says, I don't know what to do with that. I look at the world, there's no justice, and I look at the graveyard and I realize we're all being judged and we end up like animals at the end. The wages of sin is death. It is the common curse that will come to us all. So we have this built-in angst against injustice, and we wonder about God's timing and whether He'll be fair. But our own death testifies that God does judge. He's not silent in the matter. He does bring about particular ends. He tests us to see if we're going to be like the beast, and history shows us how we answer that question. But then we have to ask the question, if it's true, if my death shows that somehow God really is going to judge, do we really want justice after all? When we begin at saying, well, I looked for justice and I didn't find it. And then we look at our own end and we say, am I sure I want justice? Is that actually what I'm looking for? Or do I just want justice from you, for me, and not justice for me concerning what I may owe you or what I've done to you? At one level, we deeply want justice, but at a personal level, we don't want any at all. We love mercy for ourselves and justice for everyone else. You think about those opening illustrations. They should anger us. But think of yourself, honestly. I mean, how often are you distracted while you're driving? How often have you not looked at the road for 6 seconds? And how merciful has God been that you haven't been one to take the life of someone else in your time of simply, just being distracted with other things? As you consider the CPS workers not doing their job, surely the stakes are much higher than most of our jobs. Yet how often does our apathy lead us to not care how it affects other people in our vocation? And our laziness and the delay that it causes them and the pain that it causes them, we think nothing of it, and we ask simply, again, for mercy or a mulligan. We are often just as lazy, just as apathetic, but we think the stakes aren't so high. But really? We're just raising children after all. Have you been any lazier or apathetic with them? We're just tending to a wife or seeking to encourage and build up a husband. We've done that, of course, with all of our energies and without any apathy and without any of our own, again, cushioning the blow for ourselves, not asking, God, judge me righteously according to how I've handled all of the gifts you've given, but instead wanting and crying out for mercy. Do we really want strict justice? Really, when we ask the question? Gandalf was right when he said, many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be too eager to deal out death and judgment, for even the very wise cannot see all ends. And we see even that trajectory of the story as Frodo has a certain amount of empathy and compassion for Gollum because he knows the same pain that he's going through. This text reveals two problems that we have. Something in us demands justice, and that justice does not seem forthcoming. But what is forthcoming is death for us all, and this shows both who we are, what we deserve, and the fact that God will judge. And under the sun, there isn't any remedy to the problem that's easily delivered. You'll notice Kohelet's just like, I don't know what to do with all this. There's no justice and we all die. And it doesn't seem to get meted out any time in between. I don't know when God's going to do it, but He's surely going to do it. He does everything in its time and according to its season, but He doesn't let us in on it. And so our final thing that we want to see this morning is permission to enjoy the wait. You'll notice again, strange left turn here by the preacher, but he lands on enjoyment. He says, well, just enjoy your labors because that's the lot that God's given you in life. And there's nothing better that you can do. But he does so for a simple reason. And it's simply this, that he realizes that he has a limited field of vision and thus limited knowledge. He can't see the ultimate things. He can't see what God's doing under the sun with all these things. He can't see how God's going to judge it all and make it all right. And so since he can't see the ultimate things, he says, I have been given proximate things right in front of me that God has given me to do and to enjoy. And that's where I'm going to spend my time and energy since I can't know what I don't know. Verse 22, if I can't see what's coming next, then I should rejoice in what I see right now. But you'll notice he wants an eschatology. We all want an eschatology. We all want some ultimate end that's going to make things right. But of course, as true as that fact is, we can't predict when it is. I mean, we can't even predict what's going to happen next Wednesday, much less what God's going to do with the entirety of the universe in His grand scheme. So how do we live in the world where things just don't fall out like they should? Are you ready for the answer? Are you really ready? This is going to, I think there's a danger here. It's going to sound real trite to some, and it's going to sound really wrong to others. But Kohelet says, just enjoy what you do know. You have today, and that's a gift from God. You're being granted that moment to both enjoy and to labor and to serve. So be occupied with that thing and not with things that are too great for you. And this to many sounds like an utter cop-out. I mean, shouldn't we fight against injustice in the world? And Kohelet would say, yes, we should, where we have the power to do so. And that power is limited. A lot of us spend time and energy fighting against things where no one's hearing us. And there's no possibility of victory on some grand scale. Some people are on Twitter just fighting people they don't know on the other side of the country, neither of who have a vote in what's going on in some other state. Again, that's a waste of energy. Don't do that. Fight what's before you that you can fight. Fight for your children and your family and for your local place. Should we expect to right every wrong? Kohelet would say, no, there are far too many and you are far too small. And there are things that you are directly responsible for that will limit the time you can and should commit to other problems. Notice that you have things that God has actually given you that you are responsible for. Therefore, put your time and energy there primarily, and not vice versa, giving your time and energy to things that God has not called you to. And of course, this presses us in a special way in our own day. We see the whole world and all of its problems moment by moment from the comfort of our own home. Something that's just unheard of in history. I mean, you wouldn't know what's going on the other side of the world 300 years ago. I mean, until someone arrived on a ship, 3 months later to tell you what was going on at least 3 months ago. Think of this week alone. You have been able to engage with the realities of what's going on in Afghanistan, to all that's going on with COVID and the complexities flowing from medical and political and social infighting on those things. You've been given insight into the atrocities of the Canadian boarding school that unearthed the bodies of 1,300 First Nations children who were killed there. You know that a hurricane's about to hit land and sweep through a large cross-section of our country. And this doesn't even get into your own personal life, your own personal struggles, and the struggles of those we love in our community and in our church. So what are we to do? Where are we to spend our energy? Are you doing enough? Do you care enough? Well, the answer is no. You don't care enough. And the things you do care about you don't care about for the right reasons. And many of the things you care deeply about blind you to other things that you should care about just as deeply, and you don't. And it also uses up some of your energy on things that you should be using it on that you don't. How do we know what to do or how to move forward when we are finite people limited by the things that we can see in a world that is far too big for us to completely change? Well, the Bible would say, what is yours to do? What are you definitely responsible for? Where can you be a force for justice within the realm of your responsibility and God's limiting providence? T.S. Eliot was right when he said, teach us to care and not to care. And that's a hard lesson to learn. This doesn't cheapen the true value of each cause of true morality, but it does show you that you aren't personally equipped, situated, and responsible for each cause of morality as far as how to use your energies with regard to it. As one author intimates rightly, if there are fires everywhere, and in our world today there surely are, you have to ask the question, where should you throw your one bucket of water? And God says, do that. Do that. Work and pray. And then sit down to eat in faith and patience and know that God knows and God sees and God is just, and will not the judge of all the earth do what is right? This is the disposition of the fear of God. If under the sun there is no answer, and Kohelet is saying there's not. He says, I've looked, and there is no way to right all the wrongs down here. You can't get justice in the halls of justice because they're unjust. He's going to go on to say, you can stop one oppression, and guess what? 500 others are going to start right behind it. Doesn't mean you shouldn't fight for both, but the reality is, it's like whack-a-mole. You take care of one thing, and a bunch of others keep sprouting up. You will never solve all of the world's problems under the sun. And if his I see, over and over, I see and I saw and I saw, if that just leads to blindness, which it does, he says, I can't know what's going on, then we must say there's got to be something above the sun and a God there who sees, and that has to be enough for us. That his knowing and seeing and his timing bring us comfort. We realize that the author, God, must have a plan and a timing for his own reasons. I mean, what other choice do we have? We're all mad about injustice, and that's good. I mean, either that's just stupid because it is what it is and we can't stop it, or in some other time, in some other place, total justice will be done. The author's not saying we should give up on justice or push our hope simply to this after event, but his point is there will be no full remedy until there is a consummation of all things. Many can look at injustice and say, well, because it exists and God hasn't fixed it the way I want, then God can't be real. But of course, we can't reject God and still be mad about injustice. I mean, what do you expect from time and chance and molecules bouncing off of each other? If there is no God, then might does make right, and we should just fight the most immoral ways that we can to get what we want. If there is no God, why is everyone so mad? And to whom do you appeal when things are not working out the way they should? I mean, the universe doesn't care one lick about your current hurt or outrage. But God does. He does. And it's hard to see sometimes when we look around at natural revelation, which is what Kohelet is doing. Which is why at this point we need to depend on God's special revelation as it's revealed in his Son. That Son was convicted in the halls of justice in one of the most immoral kangaroo courts that history has ever seen. They used their power not to protect the innocent, but to protect and promote themselves, just like we do. And that Son was ridiculed and beaten like an animal, and he was buried just like one. And that grave, as he lay there for 3 days, spoke a judgment over him. It ridiculed him. It tallied him up as like all the others that said, here lies a son of Adam under the curse of death. It testified the same way our grave testifies about us. But another word was spoken. And because he was righteous, the grave could not hold him, and he was vindicated by resurrection. He was pronounced innocent before the watching world. And that innocent one now sits at the right hand of the Father on your behalf, already righteous, so that you can know the end of the story for yourself right now. You can know what God says about you right now by knowing what he says about his own Son. And if God cares that much about sin, that he's willing to crucify his own Son to deal with it, then you can be assured that all the wrongs in the world will be righted. God's not just passing over sin because he doesn't care. As Peter said, he's passing over sin, at least in your eyes presently, because he's patient. And he doesn't want any to perish, but all to come to repentance. That he's calling in his people. The cross and the resurrection scream to us that it won't always be like this. The righteous will rise, even if they get crucified in this life. And until then, our role is just to enjoy the meantime. Love and serve your neighbor in the power that you have with the responsibilities you've been given. And enjoy the gifts of God in the moments that he's giving them to you. Just to remember that we aren't that big in the world after all. But God is, and God sees. And all things will be made right. Let's pray.